Mr. President, as chairman of the Senate Veterans Committee, I want to take a moment to thank all the members of that committee for their hard work over the last year. At a time when there is obviously an enormous amount of divisiveness and partisanship here in the Senate, I am happy to report that by and large, there has been a great deal of bipartisan effort being made in the Veterans Committee, and I think very productive work as well. Mr. President, today, as the chairman of the committee, I have introduced the most comprehensive piece of veterans legislation that we have seen in a very, very long time. The Comprehensive Veterans Health and Benefits and Military Retiree Pay Restoration Act of 2014 delivers on the promises that we have made to our service members, and I believe will have the support of members of the Senate and of the House, because it addresses virtually every single issue that the veterans community has been concerned about. What we have done now is taken two omnibus bills and wrapped it into this legislation. In addition, we have taken other pieces of legislation passed by the committee, and we have added to that based on some recent developments. This legislation is the product of a year of bipartisan work and includes provisions important to almost every single veteran service organization and dozens of members of the Senate, Republican, Democrat, and Independent, many of which were reported out of the Veterans Committee with strong bipartisan support. Mr. President, this legislation completely eliminates the cuts that were made to the military retiree cost of living adjustments. I know that there was great concern here in the Senate from Democrats and Republicans about that cut, as well as in the House of Representatives, and I am happy to say that this legislation completely eliminates the cuts that were made to the military retiree cost of living adjustments. As we all know, the recently passed bill passed today, the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2013, that bill that was passed a few days ago, would lower cost of living adjustments for military retirees by reducing the annual adjustment by 1% until age 62. The American people have spoken very loudly and very clearly. They have told the Congress to restore those cuts to military retirees, and we have listened. I applaud the House and the Senate for restoring these cuts for disabled military retirees and survivors in the Appropriations Act that we passed today. So today we took care of part of the problem, but we have got to do more. And what the Comprehensive Veterans Bill that I have introduced today does is restore the full COLA to all military retirees, every single retiree. This bill restores these COLAs and does much, much more. And I would like to take a moment, Mr. President, to highlight some of the key provisions of this comprehensive piece of legislation. And let me tell you, Mr. President, this legislation is based on listening very carefully to what the veterans organizations have told us in private meetings, in hearings, and at some of the very, very large hearings that we have held with the American Legion, the VFW, the DAV, and many other service organizations. So let me very briefly touch on some of the provisions that we are addressing, some of the concerns that we are addressing in this comprehensive veterans legislation, which I should add is fully paid for. It is fully paid for. In the first omnibus bill that we passed, S944, the Veterans Health and Benefits Improvement Act of 2013, we dealt with in-state tuition assistance for post-9/11 veterans, an issue of great concern to young veterans and to all of the veterans organizations. This package includes provisions the committee's ranking member, Senator Burr and I worked together on that would help service members transition back into civilian life by making recently separated veterans eligible for tuition at the in-state rate, Given the nature of our armed forces, service members have little to no say as to where they reside during military service. Therefore, many of these service members have not had sufficient time to establish residency by the time they go back to school. This legislation would help the transition of our brave men and women who have sacrificed so much in defense of our country by giving them a fair shot at attaining educational goals without incurring an additional financial burden. We address that issue in this legislation. Mr. President, clearly one of the issues that has been an embarrassment to all of us is the degree of sexual assault that we have seen in the military. And what this legislation does is address that issue as well. While the Pentagon, Congress, and other stakeholders continue to work to end sexual assault within the military, something we have got to focus on, we must, nonetheless, do everything we can to ensure that the VA is a welcoming place for those who have survived sexual assault. That is why this legislation includes important provisions that would improve the delivery of care and benefits to individuals who experience sexual trauma while serving in the military. These provisions were inspired by Ruth Moore, a veteran who struggled for 23 years to receive VA disability compensation. It would expand access to VA counseling and care to active duty service members and members of the Guard and Reserve who experience sexual assault during inactive duty training. It also takes a number of steps to improve the adjudication of disability compensation claims based on military sexual trauma. This legislation would give VA additional tools to provide victims of sexual trauma with the care and benefits they need to confront the emotional and physical consequences of these horrific acts. Sexual assault in the military is unacceptable, and this committee is in a significant way addressing that issue. Mr. President, one of the concerns that we have heard from many veterans and veterans organizations is the issue of over-medication, that many of our veterans come back and receive, in some cases, 5, 10 different types of pills to address some of the very serious problems that they have. What this bill does is expand, among many other things, access to complementary and alternative medicine. The VA already does a good job in that area. This would expand their capability to provide complementary and alternative medicine. Maintaining VA's world-class healthcare system remains a priority for our committee. I am pleased that we were able to respond to calls from veterans to increase access to complementary and alternative medicine for the treatment of chronic pain, mental health conditions, and chronic disease. By expanding access to these treatment options such as acupuncture, meditation, massage therapy, and many others, we can enhance the likelihood veterans get the care they need in the way that works for them. And these treatments are becoming more and more popular. More and more veterans want access to them, and that is what we do in this legislation. Additionally, this legislation calls for VA to promote healthy weight in veterans by increasing their access to fitness facilities, as a healthy weight is critical to combating multiple chronic diseases, including diabetes and heart disease. In other words, the most cost-effective and best way to treat disease is to prevent that disease by making sure that our veterans have the opportunity to keep healthy, and this legislation does that as well. Mr. President, this legislation further honors as veterans certain persons who perform service in the reserve components of the armed forces. I know how important this provision is to all those who wore this nation's uniforms as members of the reserves, and I am pleased we would finally honor their service with passage of this legislation. This legislation also expands benefits for surviving spouses. for the spouses of those who gave their lives to defend this country. And I want to make special note of provisions that will be included in this package that would also strengthen the benefits and services provided to surviving family members by addressing a number of concerns brought to the attention of this committee by the Gold Star wives in testimony last year. And obviously, the Gold Star wives are the spouses of those soldiers who died in combat. Specifically, this bill would provide additional dependency and indemnity compensation for surviving spouses with children in order to provide financial support in the difficult period following the loss of a loved one. This bill would also expand the Marine Gunnery Sergeant John David Fry Scholarship to include surviving spouses of members of the armed forces who die in the line of duty. That means that surviving spouses would become eligible for post-9/11 GI Bill benefits, setting them and their families up for success in the years to follow. Mr. President, one of the issues that has occupied a great deal of time and energy on the committee deals with claim processing. We all know that for the last number of years, the VA has had a very significant backlog, and that is clearly not acceptable. When a veteran brings forth a claim, that claim should be processed in a reasonable period of time with a reasonable degree of accuracy. We are all too well familiar with the challenges of the claims backlog. I am very pleased to see that the VA is making significant progress on this complex issue. They are going from paper to digital. That is a huge process, and as a result, the backlog is declining. That is good news, but we have got to do more. This legislation would support VA's ongoing efforts and would make needed improvements to the claims system. Among a number of claims-related provisions, this bill, for the first time, would require the Department to publicly report on both claims processing goals and actual production. This would allow Congress and the public to closely track and measure VA's progress on this difficult issue. The Secretary of the VA, Eric Shinseki, has proposed a very ambitious goal for the end of 2015, and we want to make sure that they are on track. That is some of the provisions included in the first omnibus bill. Let me talk a little bit about the second omnibus bill, both of those bills passed unanimously out of committee. The Comprehensive Veterans Health and Benefits and Military Retirement Pay Restoration Act of 2014 includes provisions from S. 1581, a second omnibus bill that moved out of the committee with unanimous support at the November markup. And here are some of the provisions in that omnibus. The improvement and expansion of dental care. Mr. President, I don't know about New Mexico, but I can tell you that in Vermont, and in fact in many parts of this country, inability to access affordable dental care is a major, major crisis. It is true for the general public, and it is true for veterans as well. The truth of the matter is, right now, the VA, with the exception of service-connected oral problems, does not provide dental care to our veterans. And I think that that is a very significant omission. What this legislation does is, starting off with a large-scale pilot project, begin the effort to make sure that dental care becomes part of VA health care. And this is something that I think the veterans throughout this country will be very, very excited to learn about and to participate in. Mr. President, those are some of the provisions that were in the two omnibus bills. Now let me talk about, and they passed unanimously, let me talk about some other legislation that came out of the committee, in some cases with bipartisan support, but not unanimously. The first one deals with advanced appropriations for the VA, and that is S-932, the Putting Veterans Funding First Act of 2013. And that was introduced, as I recall, by Senators Begich and Bozeman in a bipartisan way. And here's the story here, which is very important. As we saw last year, in the event of a prolonged government shutdown, the Veterans Administration would not have been able to issue disability compensation or pension payments or provide educational benefits to millions of deserving veterans. The truth of the matter was that during that shutdown, we were perhaps a week or 10 days away from disabled veterans and others not getting the benefits that for many of them is exactly what they depend upon. It's what they depend upon to buy groceries. It's what they depend upon to pay a mortgage, to pay their car payments. We were a week or 10 days away from those veterans not getting those benefits. I'm happy to say that in this legislation, we have addressed that issue, and we have moved forward with advanced appropriations for mandatory accounts at the VA. Mr. President, our economy is making slow progress. We are creating jobs, but nobody believes that we are anywhere near where we want to be. Real unemployment in this country is close to 13%, and in my view, we owe a great deal to veterans who have left their families, left their jobs, gone abroad, and then they come back and they're unable to find employment. And what our legislation does is put into this comprehensive bill the Renew Our Vow to Hire Heroes, S6, the Putting Our Veterans Back to Work Act of 2013. And this legislation would reauthorize provisions from the VOW Act to Hire Heroes Act of 2013, including a 2-year extension to the Veterans Retraining Assistance Program, which retrains unemployed veterans for high-demand occupations. And there are other employment provisions in this legislation as well. Mr. President, several years ago, under the leadership of our colleague Patty Murray, who was my predecessor as chair of the Veterans Committee, we proudly passed the Caregivers Act. And the Caregivers Act was a very important piece of legislation which said to families who are taking care of disabled veterans, we understand that what you're doing is very, very difficult, and we're going to give you some assistance. Mr. President, after listening to the concerns, that legislation that we have passed dealt with post-9/11 veterans and their families. But after listening to the concerns of pre-9/11 veterans and their family members, I introduced S-851, the Caregivers Expansion and Improvement Act of 2013, to extend eligibility for the caregivers programs to veterans' families of all eras. All eras. So we took this program, which is working well, and we said we are going to pay attention to the needs of all families who are taking care of men and women who put their lives on the line to defend us and have become disabled. And that is in this legislation as well. Mr. President, also in this legislation is language which will extend eligibility to enroll in VA health care, and that was S-1604. We all know that early diagnosis of health care conditions is critically important. Under current law, recently separated veterans have 5 years of free health care from VA, 5 years. This legislation would extend the period of time these individuals, including members of the active component, National Guard, and reserves, they will be eligible to enroll in VA healthcare system to 10 years post-deployment. So we go from 5 years to 10 years. This benefit has been incredibly helpful to our most recent generation of service members, and extending the enrollment period would allow more individuals to take advantage of VA's high-quality, cost-effective healthcare system, including important access to mental health care services. Additionally, this legislation simplifies the process for determining eligibility for enrollment in VA health care for lower-income veterans. Currently, VA uses an extremely complex calculation of geographic income thresholds that vary from county to county. You can have one veteran in one county in Vermont, another person living a mile away. One is eligible for VA health care because of his or her income. Another person with the same income is not eligible. My legislation establishes one income threshold per state, simplifies the process, and will enable more veterans to be eligible for VA health care. Mr. President, this legislation, and I'm wrapping up now, this legislation also includes S-131, the Women's, Veterans, and Other Health Care Improvements Act of 2013. With the widespread use of improvised explosive devices throughout Iraq and Afghanistan, both female and male service members have found themselves at increased risk for spinal cord, reproductive, and urinary tract injury. Many of these veterans dream one day of starting a family, but their injuries prevent them from conceiving. This legislation would help them fulfill their dreams. Now, Mr. President, as I mentioned earlier, we have three more important provisions I want to briefly touch upon. And that is, once again, the restoration of full COLA for all military retirees. In an effort to address concerns regarding the cost of living adjustments for all military retirees, this bill would reaffirm the commitment Congress has made to our service members and veterans by ensuring consistent and appropriate funding for military retirees and veterans. This very, very important provision is in this legislation. Furthermore, there has been a concern that many CBOCs, community-based outreach clinics, that have been planned all over this country have been unable to be built for a variety of technical reasons. We address that issue as well. This bill also improves access to mental health treatment for veterans. So let me conclude by saying this. We give a lot of speeches about the respect that we have for the men and women who have put their lives on the line to defend this country. And they have come forward to the Veterans Committee and they have said, we have concerns. We have concerns about health care. We have concerns about how quickly the benefits that we apply for come to us. They have been very loud and clear in saying, and we agree with them, that it is unacceptable that pensions promised to veterans have been cut. And there have been many, many other issues dealing with employment, dealing with education. What this bill does in a comprehensive way is to say to the veterans of this country, the millions and millions of people who have given so much to us, is that we hear your concerns. We hear your concerns, and we are going to address your concerns. I want to take this moment to thank the Majority Leader who is here, Senator Reid, who has been very, very not only supportive of veterans in general, but supportive of this effort to make sure that we keep our promises to the veterans of this country. So that bill has been introduced. My hope is that we can get it to the floor as soon as possible. And I hope very much, Mr. President, that in a partisan climate, that on this issue of keeping our promises to the men and women who have put their lives on the line to defend this country, that we can come together as a Senate and come together as a House and have the President sign this bill, which will mean so much to so many. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.